versus the anti-federalists, which will eventually become the Jeffersonian Republicans, which will eventually become the Jeffersonians, or the million different names. But feds and anti-feds during this time, right? So in 1787, they have this big constitutional convention in Philadelphia. Jefferson's not there, don't make that mistake. He was still negotiating in France. He was in on the Declaration of Independence, but not the Constitutional Convention. And the idea is we're going to convince all the states to ratify a new constitution that's stronger than these weak articles of confederation, okay? There's three parts of compromise. The Constitution's all about compromise, but there's three parts. One is representation. So how do we navigate the relationship between the big states like Virginia and the small states like Rhode Island, right? So there's two plans. The Virginia plan favors the larger states. The New Jersey plan favors the smaller states. You don't need to necessarily know specifics, but you need to know the Connecticut Compromise. And the Connecticut Compromise says that we're going to have a bicameral legislation. A two-house, no, bicameral, use good words, right? Two houses, bicameral. One based on population, there you go, Virginia, you got a bunch of people, we'll give you about a lot of representation. And one based on just being a state. So everyone gets the same amount of representation, right? Those are your senators today. Bicameral, House and Senate, system of checks and balances on each other. We'll figure out the details later, but that's the compromise on representation. Second compromise, slavery. What do we do with slaves? Do we count them as population? Well, their settlement was, we're going to settle on something called the 3/5 compromise. For the purposes of taxing and the purposes of voting, we will count every slave as 3/5 of a human being. Now, don't try to do the biology behind that, but do the math, right? So if there's 100 slaves in an area, there's 60 slaves by population or, you know, taxing purposes. Yeah? You get me? Reduce the fraction. And that slave trade had to end within 20 years. So that's coming. That's the compromise on slavery. This is all part of this Constitutional Convention. Third, what do you do with imports and exports? If you don't know what those words mean by now, go back to global studies. Imports can be taxed. That's what they say. Exports can't be taxed because we don't want to stifle American business. If we tax everything that's going out, that means the people who are buying it out there, wherever they are going to have to pay more for it because there's this tax, right? But if you don't tax the stuff that's going out, you keep things cheap. What do you think China does to us today and why we buy things from China? There's probably got to be very low taxes, right? We're just paying the cost or whatever, and it doesn't provide that negative incentive. You want to bring goods in? We'll tax you on them. So now they're going to cost more than Joe Shoemaker down the street so he can sell you his shoe at a cheaper price. Does that make business sense? All part of this, this agreement, okay? Now you got to convince for ratification. We don't want a king. We don't want monarchical power. So it's Hamilton, Madison, and Jay writing the Federalist Papers. Don't read them. They're thick. I don't even know what they mean. But here's what they say. They're laying out a rationale for a need for a constitutional form of government and a strong central government, right? These are the guys that are fearful of rebellion. Then, of course, Richard Henry Lee, Jefferson, guys on the other side, write the Anti-Federalist Papers. Ultimately, they want a Bill of Rights added into the end of the Constitution because they're all about individual and state rights, you know. What's not in the Constitution is left to the people. And what's not is left to the people is left to the states, right? That's why those 9th and 10th amendments in the Bill of Rights are sort of vague and probably interpreted very differently throughout history by the Supreme Court. But if it doesn't give the federal government the power, the states and the people get it, right? So this question of where do the federal government's rights end and where the states' rights begin has been debated throughout history, right? Pretty soon you'll get to Little Rock, Arkansas, where there's a debate over black kids going to school with white kids. Who can enforce that? Is that a state law? Is that a federal government law, right? So there's clashes throughout history on states' rights. Look at the issue of slavery. Can the federal government ban slavery? Can South Carolina, Missouri? Is it up to the individual states? So this showdown and this clause in the Bill of Rights will be sort of contested throughout time. So going back to your chart, where do you start to put things? If you look at the top and you talk about leaders, well, you've got a couple different types of leaders, right? Revolutionary leaders. Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, thank God for him. Ben Franklin, early leaders in the Revolution, right? You've got constitutional leaders, so people who were involved in that conversation of putting the Constitution together. Madison, John Jay, who become Washington's Secretary of Treasury, no, that's Hamilton, State maybe. Hamilton, obviously a constitutional leader. And then you've got political leaders, eventually guys like Washington, Thomas Jefferson, who's coming in this time period. We don't talk a ton about women during this time period, but Abigail Adams might be a name that you want to hold on to. She penned the document, Remember the Ladies, in that constitutional conversation, right? Women are playing a vital role during the Revolution, manning the farm, serving as nurses. That's kind of where we get into that. African Americans during this time period. Probably the biggest one is the 3/5 compromise on the idea of both voting and taxing. Christmas Addicts was a dock worker. A very famous story about him. Phyllis Wheatley, a poet, Ben Banneker. Phyllis Wheatley was a poet. Ben Banneker was an African American architect at the time. He actually designed the city of Washington, D.C., where we're going to move the capital pretty soon. Literature, you've got Common Sense for sure. The Federalist Papers. We don't have a lot of novels. We're not in the 1820s, the 1830s yet, right, where people start to distinctly write about nature in America, and we don't really have that yet, right? So a lot of these categories aren't really fair. We'll close the story at 1783 with the election of George Washington as our first president. He sets a lot of precedents, meaning this is the first time that a president has to do this. Many presidents in the future have followed Washington's lead in what he did during his first term, in his first days as president. But as Bailey says, we're going to launch the ship of the new state, right? So that critical period really sets up the Constitution, addresses the failures of the Articles, and we're off and running with Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Tyler, Polk, Taylor, Fillmore. We'll get going on all the presidents, okay? Questions about that time period? With a minute to spare. So we'll go like Washington through the Compromise of 1850 on the dawn of that road to the Civil War sometime next week.
Tell us, we'll put it in the calendar.